We begin one of the fundamental kashrus questions in the Gemara. We saw in the Mishnah that there are certain foods and certain pastes or certain mixtures that are not a standalone chametz, like a piece of bread, that are also prohibited. We had these are called chametz b'ta'aroves, chametz in a mixture, or chametz noksha. Chametz noksha is when you have chametz, it's a flour and water-based mixture, so it's dough. However, it's not edible. It's hard. It's atypical and not a food. And so the concept normally when we think of chametz, is chametz be'en, chametz by itself. It's a standalone. What we have in the Mishnah as well is chametz b'ta'aroves, chametz in a mixture. And there are various ways of looking at this and why this would be prohibited. Now, generally, we would understand that you have chametz, even though it's in a mixture, it should be prohibited. There's no nullification, so what would get rid of the chametz? So, of course, it should be prohibited. However, there are multiple ways of this affecting, or the non-chametz components affecting the chametz. One concept that we're going to see is the concept of heter mitztaref le'isser. Heter, something that's permissible, combining with that which is prohibited in order to complete the requisite amount. We know, generally, when we talk about anything that's prohibited in eating or sometimes owning, various other halachic ramifications, are the numbers, the minimum amount, the requisite amount in order to be held liable or responsible for that action is a kazayas. But there are other measures. Whatever measure it would be, you would generally think you need a kazayas of chametz in order to transgress, or at least be held responsible for transgressing the, let's say in our case, the eating of chametz. However, there's a concept of heter mitztaref le'isser, that the permissible components also would combine with the prohibited components to become the requisite amount. So in our Mishnah, when it says that you have a mixture of, say, this dip that has bread in it, as well as sour milk and salt and vinegar, etc., right? So you have this milk component, which is not prohibited on Pesach, and you have the chametz component, which is prohibited on Pesach. So the heter mitztaref le'isser would tell us that you don't have to eat a full kazayas of the chametz components, but even just a kazayas total, which includes in it some chametz and some non-chametz, would also equal up. It would also equal the amount of a kazayas, and this is called heter mitztaref le'isser, where the permissible components combine into the requisite amount of a kazayas, and just having some of it be chametz. That's one way of having the ta'aroves, the mixture, where some of it is chametz, some is not, and it would count as a transgression. The other way is where kazayas b'chdei achilas pras, where you're really only the chametz components would combine to the requisite amount. So you need a kazayas, you would have to have a kazayas of chametz. However, you don't have to have it in the first bite. You don't have to have it in any one single kazayas bite, but rather you would have it combined between a normal eating moment. And what is that? As long as it would take to eat a pras. A pras is a measure. We'll see it later in the Gemara. This is a measure of a section of a bread, which is 4 eggs worth. The main point is that you eat the kazayas within normal time of eating a portion of bread. And so this is estimated to be about 5 minutes, and 3 minutes in the shortest, 9 minutes in the longest measure, but and let's say 5 minutes. Okay, so we're going to use the measure of 5 minutes for kedei achilas pras, and so you don't have to eat a kazayas in any one bite. But if you eat a kazayas in this mixture, combined throughout the 5 minutes of eating, that would combine to a single kazayas. So we have heter mitzdaref leiser, the first measure, where within one bite, as long as you have some chametz, the permissible sections within the mixture would combine. The second version says no, heter mitzdaref leiser is not the heter, the permissible part, does not combine with the iser, but it doesn't nullify it either, and so the prohibited components will combine in multiple bites, in multiple eatings, as long as it's one session, let's call it, of 5 minutes, kadei achilas pras, and the time it would take to eat this portion of bread, that would all combine into one eating. We have another component, another version, which is, we'll see, the Gemara attributes to Rabbi Akiva here, that is ta'am ke'ikr. If you have a flavor of the food, the prohibited food, in the permissible food, then the permissible food becomes prohibited. And so it's not that the permissible food combines with the prohibited food to equal the kazayas, the minimum amount, but rather that the permissible food which tastes like, is now infused with flavor of the prohibited item, now becomes as prohibited as the prohibited item. This is called ta'am ke'ikr. If it has the flavor, if you can taste the prohibited item, it is like you're eating that prohibited item. So with that introduction, we're going to begin Daf Mem Dalet. This is the fifth to last line of Mem Gimel Amid Beis 43b. Amar Rabbi Abo. Rabbi Abo has said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Kol isurin shebetorah. This is a general rule for all prohibitions in the Torah. Ein heter mitzdaref leiser. When you have a mixture of a permissible item and a prohibited item, you would have to have a full kazayas of the prohibited item, and the permissible item would not combine with the prohibited item to get the requisite kazayas. Besides for chutz mi'isuri ana, nazir. Besides for the prohibitions of nazir. Nazir is someone who accepts upon themselves the Nazirite oath. The nazir is prohibited in anything that comes from the grapevine, is prohibited in becoming tameh, is prohibited in cutting his hair. At the end of the session, they'd have to bring a offering. This is a nazir. So the nazir, the Torah says, Shari Amro Torah Mishras. The Torah says anything soaked. So the understanding of soaked is where you dip your bread in wine. The bread now absorbs some of the wine. Mishrash is soaking. So now you have a permissible component and a prohibited component. And the Torah, in telling us Mishras, tells us that by Nazir, that the bread will combine with the wine, and you don't need a full requisite amount of a kazayas full of wine, but rather the bread itself would combine. So you have a little bit of wine and a little bit of bread. They combine to a kazayas, and it's prohibited. And Zeiri adds, Zeiri Amar Afsa Ur Bal Taktiru, on the Mizbeach as well, if you had some leavened bread, some chametz, together with the mincha. And the mincha has to be a flour based offering, and the kohen takes a full kometz and puts it on the mizbeach. In this kometz, if it has some chametz and some non-chametz, Rashi says that they're recognizable. Tosa says even if the chametz is not recognizable, we're not going to get into that aspect of this discussion, which obviously is broadens the question. But for now, just the concept. If you have some chametz and some non-chametz, even though that the Torah does not prohibit it, non-chametz, but the permissible parts will combine to the prohibited part to make it a prohibition, a complete prohibition. Come on. So whose opinion is this like? This is like the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, the Dorish Kol. We saw yesterday machlokas of whether or not we say Kol in regards to the prohibition of chametz on the mizbeach, and that the Kol it says as it says over there, Kol Sa'or, any leavening, and that adds this is what we said earlier, that even miktsasa, even some of the even it doesn't have to be a full kazayis of chametz on the mizbeach, even some of the olive size, any amount of chametz on the mizbeach. Now, the crumb itself of chametz that you put on the mizbeach is not going to be sufficient because it doesn't count as an act of putting on the mizbeach. So it must be that the rest, the requisite amount is filled by the kosher components, by the heter, by the permissible part. So Gemara says, "Ihachi." If that's the case, that it's not only the chametz part, but the heter part combines to the prohibited part. Now we're at Mem Daled Amud Aleph 44a at the top. So that for chametz as well, we should say not only for nazir for the wine and bread and wine, not only for the chametz on the mizbeach together with the matzah with the unleavened flour, but also for chametz on Pesach, we should say the same thing. That in our Mishnah, when it says that there's a mixture of chametz and non-chametz, that the non-chametz would fill the kazayas requisite. The Gemara says, "Einachanami." Indeed, since the basis of Rabbi Eliezer is from the word kol, and we said kol machmetzes, so in chametz as well, we have the word kol, and so even a lesser amount of chametz. So you ate a half an olive size of chametz, but it was a full olive size of food. Some of it kosher for Pesach, and some was chametz, that it would combine to a full transgression. And this is in contradistinction with Abaye that who says in the Gemara Menachos in regards to the flour offerings going on the mizbeach, that actually you don't need a kazayas of offering on the mizbeach. And so the whole reason we said that we need the combination of the permissible part to combine with the prohibited to get a requisite amount, actually Abaye says there is no minimum amount of offering on the mizbeach. Any amount of offering of chametz on the mizbeach would count as an offering. So the reason there's a transgression of any amount of chametz on the mizbeach is not because the rest combines to make a prohibited minimum, but rather because there is no minimum. The Amar Yeshak Torah because Abaye says in the Gemara in Menachos that actually you can have a lesser amount of offering on the mizbeach that would count and therefore the chametz would count as a transgression. There is no minimum. So by nazir, we understand that there's a minimum you have to be in order to count as eating. It has to have a minimum of a kazayas. There is no such thing as it counting as eating if you eat a crumb. So therefore, if the minimum is a kazayas and olive size, you need the combination of the bread to the wine to get the requisite olive size. By chametz, we would have the same, but we have no proof from Sa'or because according to Abaye, there is no minimum amount of the Sa'or of the leavening on the mizbeach. Therefore, this statement of Ze'iri is going to be in contradistinction, in opposition to the opinion of Abaye, and say that it says that no, there is a minimum amount on a mizbeach, and therefore, if there's a minimum amount, and yet Rabbi Eliezer says that from the word kol, we see that even a speck of chametz, well, maybe not a speck, maybe that would be nullified, but a little bit of chametz, less than an olive size. The heter, the permissible part, would combine with the prohibited to complete the requisite amount. That no, there is no haktara less than a kazayas, and you need the heter mitzdaraf l'issa, the permissible combining to the prohibited. Yasser Rav Dimi kamal al hashmaita. Rav Dimi would repeat this teaching. Amar le Abaye. And we talked about that Rav Dimi traveled from Babel to Eretz Yisrael and back, and so Rabbi Yochanan was the head of the academy in Eretz Yisrael, and Rav Dimi would bring that teaching to the academy in Eretz Yisrael, in Babylon, and Abaye Abaye responded to Rav Dimi, is this really true that this is specific to the Nazir and maybe also to Chametz? It seems to be elsewhere as well. We have this concept that heter mitzaraf le'iser, that there's a prohibition of that the permissible parts would combine with the prohibited parts to get to the requisite amount, to the minimum. But Tanan, we learned hamakbeh. A makbeh is a congealed, so a porridge of sort. Shel teruma. The base is made of teruma. So you have wheat, and you made some sort of cereal with that, and it's hardened. It's somewhat congealed. V'hashum v'hashemen shel chulin. But the spices, the garlic and the oil, that's not of teruma. And somebody who went to the mikveh that day, but the sun hadn't set, which we learned earlier, it creates a invalidation. There's still a certain level of tuma left that creates an invalidation to teruma when this tavul yom, someone went to the mikveh that day, touches it, and it touched only part of it, so the entire thing becomes invalid. Pasal es kula, because the base is teruma. However, a makbeh shel chulin, if the base, the wheat of this porridge is going to be non-teruma. However, the garlic in there or the oil in there, the spices, v'ashum hashemen shel teruma, that's what's teruma. So nogat tavul yom miktasan, if a tavul yom, someone went to the mikveh that day, so therefore they invalidate teruma by touching it. If they touched one bit of this porridge, only the place they touched becomes invalidated. And we thought about this and said, okay, so what's the basis here? Why is even the place he touched become tummy? What he touched is essentially a wheat base. The spices, the garlic, and everything, and the oil, though that's nullified within the mixture, and therefore it should not become tamei at all. And Rabbi Bar Bachana explained matam. So what is the basis that when he touches this, that even the spices in there become invalid? Because if a non-kohen were to eat this porridge, one kazayas is sufficient to make him transgress and be held responsible for eating a kazayas of teruma. Now, he didn't eat a kazayas of teruma. He ate a kazayas, an olive size of the porridge, within which there is some teruma in the flavors, in oil, in the garlic. But for the most part, it's going to be the permissible non-teruma. And so we see, since the olive size is mostly non-teruma, and yet a non-kohen eating it would be held liable on account of that. So we see that the porridge itself has a teruma halacha, and therefore when he touches it, that part that he touched becomes tamei or invalid. Now, hechidami, what's the basis over here that he would be prohibited or held responsible for eating the teruma of in eating a kazayas, even though that it's the minority of that? Lav mishum neheter mitzaraf liser. So Abaye says, wouldn't you say the reason is because the permissible components, the wheat base, is going to be, it will fill in the olive size and combine with the prohibited to meet the requisite amount. So therefore, you see, even by teruma or other prohibitions, we see they have the same concept of heter mitzaraf le'iser, that there's a combination of the permissible and prohibited to get a full amount of prohibition. So Gemara says, no, that's not the reason over there. There, when we said the concept that he eats an olive size, a non-kohen was going to be held liable, my kazayis the ika kazayis b'chdei achilas pras. What he means is that when he eats the full bowl of porridge, and so he ate the entire amount, and in that entire amount, he'll eat it within the kedei achilas pras, as long as it would take to eat a portion of bread. and this portion of bread would take, let's say, 5 minutes. So in Kedei Achilas Pras, he would eat the whole thing, and in there, all the garlic pieces combined and all the oil combined, the prohibited parts combined to a kazayas. So it's not that the permitted parts will fill in the prohibited into a kazayas, but rather the time is going to allow that it's all going to count as one action, and all the little bits will combine to a prohibited amount, but a kazayas. But it's not that permissible parts combined to prohibited, but rather the sufficient amount in there that one would eat it typically within a 5-minute lapse, a Kedei Achilas Pras, and therefore it combines. And this is a Torah concept that the combination of Kedei Achilas Pras within the time of eating a bread, all the prohibited parts will combine to a kazayas. He said, yes, indeed. This is a Torah concept, and we use this for the night of the Seder, where also you have to eat a kazayas of matzah, an olive size of matzah, and that it doesn't have to be in one bite. It can be in, as long as you do so within Kedei Achilas Pras, in mitzvahs as well. So this is a concept that in Torah, in the Torah, both in prohibitions and in mitzvahs, as long as you eat a kazayas, an olive size within an Achilas Pras, within the time to eat a portion of bread, let's call it 5 minutes, that all that you ate within that time would count to the kazayas, and it doesn't have to be an olive size in one bite. So he challenged and said, well, if this is true, that this is a Torah concept, that Kedei Achilas Pras equals a kazayas, that if you eat it within the time of a portion of bread, it's going to be a count towards your minimum amount of a kazayas. So why in our Mishnah, by the dip, the Kutach HaBavli dip, which has bread in it as well as milk in it and other things, why did the Chachamim why is there a machlokas of whether or not you transgress? You'll have a kazayas combined. Elamai mishum dehetem etzaref le'isur. Must be that it's a machlokas of whether the permissible parts, the milk, will combine with the bread parts to equal a kazayas. So he says no. However, you're going to understand it. Why do they disagree? Either way, if you have a kazayas in there, so that they should say it's prohibited. Rather, don't bring in that discussion of the mixtures in our Mishnah. The less because in all of those, there actually isn't even a kazayas of prohibited manner within of chametz within achilas pras and what somebody would normally eat in 5 minutes. Because if he's just going to take a spoonful of the dip of the kutach habavli, the kasarav ka'achale, that he would just eat it all at once. But it's like eating a spoonful of ketchup. Nobody does that. I mean, and if somebody does, it doesn't count as a normal eating. This is a condiment. And so nobody eats it this way. And if he did, his intentions are nullified by the norms and it wouldn't count. And if he's just dipping things in it, you'll never equal an olive size of the chametz components within the mixture if it's just used as a dip in a 5 minute achilas pras. And therefore, it's not. That's the disagreement in our Mishnah. Don't bring in our Mishnah because our Mishnah you don't have an olive size in any case. So he asks a contradiction from here. You have 2 pots. In one pot, the Kohen is cooking his teruma foods. And in one pot, he's cooking the mundane, the chulin, the non-teruma foods. Well, if name shtei meduchas, and he also uses pestle and mortar to grind up some spices, and he has 2 sets of spices there. One of teruma to go into the teruma pot, and one of chulin to go into the chulin pot. Well, if name shtei meduchas achashel chulin achashel teruma v'naflu elu techelu, and then they slipped out of his hand and they fell in, and he doesn't know which one fell into which pot. So we're going to say something we call taliyah, that we're going to make an assumption and we're going to sort of hang the teruma on the teruma, the prohibited on the prohibited. We say, look, this is permissible, and the spices were permissible. Here we had a pot that's prohibited, meaning prohibited to anybody that's not a Kohen or has the particular rules. And we had the spices that are also prohibited. So we're going to assume the spices that are prohibited fell into prohibited and not to the other, which would then cause a prohibition in the other pot. So we're going to say that teruma fell into teruma and the chulin fell into teruma, into the chulin. We're going to say that they each sort of matched up. Now, if it's true that this is not a Torah prohibition, because you just have spices and it's not going to equal a kazayas and olive size and achilas pras, so therefore it's never going to be a Torah prohibition anyhow. It's going to be a rabbinic prohibition, and therefore we were lenient and said, since it's a matter of doubt, we can be lenient and assume the heter fell into heter, the permissible fell into the permissible. However, if this was a Torah prohibition, if actually you would equal a kazayas by eating it within achilas pras, and that's a Torah concept, so then why are we being lenient? You can't be lenient in the doubt of a Torah prohibition. And if you tell me eating an olive size within the time that it takes to eat a bread, so 5 minutes, it would count as a Torah combined to equal a Torah prohibition. Why are you assuming that Truma fell into Teruma? He said there it's not a measure that's rabbinic. No, you're right. In truth, the concept of the combination of an olive size throughout the time of eating that they would combine, that's a Torah prohibition, and that's a Torah concept. So why over here are we lenient with the spices and the food? Because the teruma whole concept on spices is rabbinic. Because really the Torah says dagan, tirosh, and yitzar, grains, wine, and oil, and olive oil. So that's all you have as the Torah obligation of teruma. So the spices, the garlic and the onion and the chives and whatever else you had in there that you were grinding and tossing into, those are rabbinic teruma to begin with. And that's why you can be lenient. It's not that the measure is rabbinic. The measure is d'oraisa, that a combination of kazayas within achilas pras, within an allotted time of eating bread, that's going to be a Torah concept. The teruma basis of the spices itself is rabbinic. So we ask another question. So you have a bundle of teruma and a bundle of chulin, and they fell into your vat, or your large containers, one of chulin and one of teruma. Again, now we're going to say that we can assume each one fell into its own kind, even though that over there also you're going to have enough to have a kazayas in achilas pras. Yet it's permissible. There too, we're going to say the chulin, the non-teruma fell into the mundane to the non-teruma, and the teruma fell into teruma, and so nothing became more prohibited than it was before. And if it's a Torah concept that all the little bits will combine to a kazayas to measure within a lot of time of eating, so you may have that measure in these grains. He says, well, actually, you're right. This is talking about grains, which would be a Torah concept of teruma. However, teruma nowadays is rabbinic, because the obligation teruma would have to be that Am Yisrael is in Eretz Yisrael. It would have to be that the Shemitah and Yovel is kept. We don't have. We're missing some components of our sovereignty and our living in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore teruma is rabbinic. Teruma nowadays is rabbinic. So in a rabbinic manner, you can rely on this doubt and say, well, I don't know that the teruma fell into the mundane, so therefore I can be lenient and eat it as is. So what we now have is the conclusion, or the first set of the conclusion of the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan says, in all matters other than in regards to a nazir, the permissible will not combine to the prohibited, but by nazir it does combine to meet the requisite amount. And Zeiri adds chametz. chametz in the mizbeach, chametz on Pesach. And then we have another concept of in all prohibitions that there's a heter that if you have so much of the prohibited item that when you eat it in a typical way, you will equal a kazayas, an olive size, within the allotted time of 5 minutes that it would take to eat a portion of bread. That would be a full. That would count as a prohibition. Now the Gemara challenges v'hai mishras lahacher diasa. Is mishras, the soaking of bread in the wine, coming to teach you the concept of heter mitzaraf l'isur, that the permissible combines with the prohibited? No. We need it for something else. We learned in the Brisa, and now we turn to Mem Dalet Amud Aleph. Mishras comes to tell us litin ta'am ke'ikr, that if you just taste the prohibited item, that's as if the prohibited item is the main and it becomes prohibited itself. And the permissible item is not going to combine to fill the requisite amount. Rather, the permissible item becomes prohibited. So if you use lard, pig fat, to grease your pan and you put some vegetables in there and saute it, now it has the flavor of the pig. It's not that little bit of fat is going to combine with the prohibited items, but rather the carrots and onions and everything that you sauteed in there now actually, since they have the flavor, are like eating a piece of pig. And this tells us not that if you soaked bread in wine, but rather you took a grape and dropped it into water and let it sit there enough that now the water has some flavor of the grape, and it tastes, it has a taste of the grape. Chayiv, that the nazir will be held liable on account of eating grape, even though he just drank the water. But since it has flavor of the grape, that's going to count as a Torah prohibition of eating the prohibited item. And this is tam ki'ikr. Flavor is like the component itself. And this is true that we learn it from here to the rest of the Torah. Uman nazir she'en yisura Yisrael. Nazir, which is not a permanent prohibition. It's only for the allotted time that the person accepted upon themselves, and not for the accepted time that the person accepted this nazir oath upon themselves. Generally 30 days or whatever they stipulate. And it's not a prohibition to benefit from the grapes. The nazir is allowed to sell grape, although it's not advisable for someone to be handling grape if they're not allowed to eat it. But they're allowed to benefit from it. And there's actually an out where they can have their vow annulled. So it's a pretty weak prohibition in the sense of its components. And nevertheless, nevertheless, the Torah says that just the flavor is sufficient to prohibit and switch the permissible food into a prohibited item. So then for sure, kilayim, the mixture of prohibited planting, where you take grains and you plant it in your vineyard, which is going to be prohibited, and it'll be prohibited forever. Once it grows that way, you can never eat from it. And you're not allowed to benefit from it. And there's no backtracking, there's no way out of this prohibition. Then for sure, which is a much more severe prohibition, for sure the prohibition would include also not the flavor. So if the flavor of this food infuses flavor into something else, that would become the prohibition itself. And the same, let's say, for arla, the first fruits of a tree, which it says within the 4th year, which is called rovai. And two of these components, because it once it's prohibited forever, and it's prohibited in benefit. So Hamani, whose opinion is this that says that we're learning the concept of mishras for tam ke'ikr? This is the Rabbanan that tell us that flavor is the main component. For Rabbi Yochanan, who said earlier that mishras is coming to tell you flavor, tell you the combination of heter and iser, Amar Rabbi Akiva. He said, like Rabbi Akiva, Hi, Rabbi Akiva. Where do we find the statement of Rabbi Akiva? Ilaim Rabbi Akiva de Masnitin. Is it Rabbi Akiva in a Mishnah de Tanan? As we learned, Rabbi Akiva Aimer. Rabbi Akiva says, Nazir shashara pita bayayin, a Nazir who soaks his bread in wine, and now you have bread and you have wine, and they combine to the requisite amount. And there's enough there that they would equal an olive size. Presumably, 60-70% of it is bread, and 30-40% is the wine, but nevertheless it'll equal a kazayas chayiv. So he's going to be held liable, and that's what Rabbi Akiva said. How do you know that it means that there's a kazayas combined to the bread and the wine? Maybe what he means over there is maybe what he meant is there's a full olive size of the wine in the bread. Well, and if you're going to tell me, well, then what is Rabbi Akiva telling me? Of course, if you had a kazayas of wine, you're going to be held responsible because that's the prohibition. Maybe it's because it's not standing alone. It's not just there. It's infused. It's absorbed by something else. It's a mixture. It's no longer, even though you can see it and you can smell it and you can taste it, but it's not a standalone. It's absorbed into something else. Maybe the mixture is enough to nullify it and not hold you responsible. And that's where Rabbi Akiva had to tell you, no, that it counts as if you ate a kazayas. But we're talking about a full olive size of the wine itself. Ella Rabbi Akiva the brisa. So it must be Rabbi Akiva in a brisa. The time we learned Rabbi Akiva Aimer, Nazir shashara pita bayai, a Nazir who soaked his bread in wine. And here he says explicitly, and he ate of the bread and wine combined the kazayas. Chayiv is going to be held liable. Rabbi Akiva, so great. So now we have the Chachamim will learn from this soaking. They say the soaking of the Torah means a grape in water, and the water is now infused with the flavor of the grape. And therefore the water becomes grape and is itself prohibited. Rabbi Akiva says, no, it's talking about soaking bread in wine, and now there's actual wine absorbed in the bread, and therefore the combination of bread and wine will equal a kazayis. This is heter mitzdaref liser. Where did Rabbi Akiva now know this concept that elsewhere we say that flavor infused in a food is sufficient to make the food like the prohibited item itself? Rabbi Akiva tam ki ikar minole. And this is, we know, that's the concept in Torah, that you have, if you can taste the prohibited item, it's all prohibited. Yalaf mi basa b'chalav. He learns it from the mixture of milk and meat. Lav taima ba'almehu. There's no, you sauteed your meat in butter. There's no butter there. It's all absorbed. It's nullified. So all you have left with is flavor. And nevertheless, the Torah prohibits it. Va'aser. Hachanami. So therefore, Lashno, anywhere else, we're going to learn the same thing. Flavor is enough to make it prohibited. V'Rabbana, and the Rabbanan say you can't compare it. You can't learn to every prohibition from milk and meat. Milk and meat is a very specific and a very unique prohibition. It's unique. It's a chiddush. What's unique about basa v'chalav? Milk and meat. Is it unique because this is permissible and this is permissible? When you combine them, they're prohibited, and therefore it's a unique prohibition. It's actually not so unique. It's not unique because we find elsewhere this thing. John, I'll get to you in a moment. It's not unique because we find this elsewhere, that the Torah prohibits two things that independently are permissible and combined are prohibited. The mixture of seeds, which you talked about before, you plant your grains in your vineyard. Grains are permissible. Vineyard is permissible. You plant them together. They're prohibited. And when you combine them, they're permissible. Prohibited. Even though each part is prohibited. We say the same in mixed wool and linen. Wool is permissible to wear. Linen's permissible to wear. You mix them, they're prohibited. This is not a new concept. This is something we find throughout the Torah and elsewhere as well. Ella, so rather must be the uniqueness is something else. The itaru lekula yoma b'chal b'shari. If you soaked your meat all day in milk, don't try this trick at home. You soak your meat in milk all day you have not transgressed anything. You put it in a pot and turn on the flame, you transgress because you cooked them together. That's a unique prohibition. Soaking it all day, no problem. Turning on the fire, Torah prohibition. But once you cooked it, it's going to be prohibited. That's a unique prohibition. So don't tell me that, by milk and meat, just having the flavor turns the whole thing into prohibition. So therefore, everywhere else it's that way. No, milk and meat's a very unique prohibition. Rabbi Kiva agrees to that. So that's not his source. Rather, we learn it from the obligation of koshering vessels. The Torah told us that when we came back from the war with Midian, we brought back vessels in the desert, and the Torah said that which went into fire has to go through fire, and that which gets cooked in water has to go into water, boiling water, if for something that you cook in, and torching something and heating it up with a flame for something that you fry in or that is a spit. In any way, the Torah said that you have to kosher the vessels. Now, there's no substance on the vessel, but rather it's flavor infused into the vessel. And so you see the flavor that would then come out into your food is considered prohibition. So you see that flavor is sufficient to prohibit food. Isn't it only flavor? So too over here, no issue. And the Rabbanan say, the Chachamim say, yeah, that's also a unique prohibition. Why? Because generally we say, if something gives a bad flavor, it's not a good taste, it isn't prohibited. In fact, even if the prohibited food itself becomes rancid, it's no longer prohibited. The Gamrina Nevela, we learn from Nevela, where the Torah said an animal that died, roadkill, it wasn't shechted, it wasn't slaughtered properly. The halacha is, the Torah says, give it to a non-Jew, right? And we learn from the fact that the Torah says, give it has to be something worthy of giving. It still has good taste. Once it's rancid, there's no prohibition anymore. V'hacha aser, and over here, yet, even though that the flavor, once it went into the pot and then it comes out, it's no longer a good flavor. It's the next day, and it goes bad. Rabbi Kiva Rabbi Chia. And Rabbi Kiva says no. Like Rabbi Chia said, that it's talking about that 24-hour had not passed and the flavor infused in the pot had not gone rancid yet. Hilkach and the Rabbanan respond, now a pot, it's for sure somewhat less flavorful than it was before, and yet the Torah prohibits it. So we're going to revisit tomorrow this concept and then go further in the ideas of Tam Ke'ikr, of Nos and Tam Lev Gam. If it gives a bad flavor or that which is infused in the pot is already somewhat going bad, and therefore the flavor that comes out should be less of flavor, and nevertheless the Torah prohibits it. The Chachamim consider that a novel idea, a new idea, and therefore it's unique to here and not anywhere else, and they need a teaching from Nazir. And Rabbi Kiva says, no, from here this is sufficient. From the fact the Torah said we have to kosher the vessels of Midian, we learn that flavor is sufficient to prohibit your food and make the food itself be considered a prohibition. What was your question, John?
So what if I can get the exact same flavor using all kosher ingredients?
That's not a problem. It's the substance of the prohibited item infused into the permissible. If you have an imitation bacon, that's not going to be prohibited. It's flavor from the bacon that's infusing into your food.
So if the person that's eating it doesn't know where the flavor came from, there's no issue for them. It's only the person that actually cooked it?
No. As long as the flavor actually comes from a prohibited substance, it is prohibited. In other words, the infusion of flavor keeps the substance alive within here as long as it's the substance. So if the substance is prohibited, so that's kept alive by its flavor. If the substance is a permissible item, it's kept alive in here by its flavor. It's whatever, tam ke'ikr. The flavor is like its base itself, like the main thing. So if the main thing is permissible, so the flavor is also permissible. If the main thing's prohibited,